As Walter Scheidel rightly predicted back in the early days of the pandemic, author of the now classic The Great Leveler, Violence and the History of Inequality from the Stone Age to the 21st Century, COVID-19, despite being the most disruptive event since World War II, was highly unlikely to be a leveling event. Far from it given the accumulation of wealth to the top 1% over this period and the record number of new billionaires that were created. But where the proliferation of conspiracy theories about vaccinations, lockdowns, and a pandemic captured most of the energy of alternative media during this time, such a discourse merely throws the baby out with the bathwater. The most insidious aspect of the legacy of the pandemic has been above all epistemological, the way in which the political imagination has been hijacked, and how what could have offered the potential for a mass reckoning in light of a convergence of crises, AI, environmental degradation, breakdown of globalization, and so on, ended up becoming a breeding ground for conspiracism as a cynical, direct or indirect, means of capturing and misdirecting systemic critique, displacing populist anger onto abstract and mythologized elites as a means of eroding trust in collective action and public institutions. The central argument of Scheidel's book is that the only historical forces that have substantially reduced inequality were radically disruptive in nature: mass mobilization wars, transformative revolutions, state collapse, and pandemics. Moreover, where economists and historians have sought to draw a line between malign and benign factors when it comes to the Great Leveling period between 1914 and 1980, Scheidel demonstrates how it is impossible to separate the rise of democratic statism and post-war Keynesianism in particular from the shocks which preceded it. The reduction in inequality witnessed after World War II, the so-called Golden Age of social democracy in Western Europe and parts of the global North, is often viewed as a triumph of enlightened policymaking. Yet Scheidel cautions against such retrospective idealization. The very conditions that made large-scale redistribution possible, devastation of capital, destruction of infrastructure, mass death, and a radical reorganization of geopolitical power, were anything but peaceful or planned. Scheidel's point is not to glorify war, revolution, but to emphasize the structural dependency of progressive outcomes on shock. The attempt to distinguish good policymaking, post-war reconstruction, the Marshall Plan, Social Security expansion, from bad shocks, war, depression, is historically incoherent. Depending on political, military, and economic circumstances specific to individual countries, leveling could be sudden or more gradual, concentrated during the war years, or deferred to post-war crises, or spread out across longer periods. Yet the outcome was always the same, regardless of whether countries lost or won, suffered occupation during or after the war, and were democracies or run by autocratic regimes. Mass mobilization for the purpose of mass violence was the engine of a transnational transformation of the distribution of income and wealth. This complicates the idea, popular on parts of the left, that inequality can be peacefully planned out of existence. As Scheidel makes clear, elites rarely concede ground absent external constraint, and that constraint has historically come from exogenous shock, whether war, plague, or revolution. The contemporary myth of peaceful reform as the default method of leveling obscures the historical fact that redistribution tends to follow, rather than precede, dislocation. Total war and the fabric of redistribution. The experience of total war in the 20th century, especially World War II, forcibly restructured class relations and created the material and ideological basis for post-war redistribution. One of the most striking shifts was the widespread acceptance of high progressive taxation, particularly on the wealthy. In the United States, the top marginal income tax rate reached an astonishing 94%. In Britain, the top income tax rate rose from 6% in 1900 to 97.5% by 1941, during the final years of the war. As Thomas Piketty writes, to a large extent it was the chaos of war with its attendant economic and political shocks that reduced inequality in the 20th century. There was no gradual, consensual, conflict-free evolution toward greater equality. In the 20th century it was war, and not harmonious democratic or economic rationality, that erased the past and enabled society to begin anew with a clean slate. Such taxation was politically possible because, the war effort created a shared sense of sacrifice. Wealthy elites could not easily argue for exemption or privilege while working-class men were dying in Europe and the Pacific. The Roosevelt administration promoted the idea that luxury consumption during wartime was morally obscene. The Revenue Act of 1942 dramatically expanded the number of Americans paying income tax and introduced steep taxes on luxury goods. Even advertising reflected this moral shift, with posters urging citizens to use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. In Britain, the wartime economy brought similar changes. The rationing of goods, the reorientation of industry, and the nationalization of key sectors during the war fostered a powerful egalitarian ethos. Luxury goods were not only discouraged, but taxed into near non-existence, while the Ministry of Food regulated prices to prevent profiteering. Furthermore, the scale of conscription and national mobilization blurred class distinctions. As Scheidel emphasizes, shared vulnerability to death and destruction disrupted the insulation of elites, contributing to what he calls the Great Compression of income and wealth inequality. The universality of sacrifice made it politically impossible to sustain pre-war hierarchies, at least temporarily. Wartime unity became the moral pretext for reconstruction projects such as the British welfare state, famously encapsulated in the Beveridge Report of 1942, which called for the abolition of the five giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. Sacrifice and political mobilization. In this context, the emphasis on sacrifice operated not merely as a cultural motif, but as a means, indirect or otherwise, to contest power. It made coercive economic transformation palatable by embedding it within narratives of duty, survival, and solidarity, aligning private discomfort with public virtue. Even capitalists were forced to accept temporary controls, nationalizations, and planning regimes under the ideological banner of wartime necessity. That many of these controls persisted into the post-war period, such as rent controls, price ceilings, and state-run industries, owed much to the cultural legitimacy that wartime sacrifice conferred upon them. The decades preceding the First World War, often nostalgically referred to as the Belle Époque or the Golden Age of the bourgeoisie, were marked by a historic high point of elite autonomy, minimal taxation, and the flourishing of a liberal international order. In this laissez-faire world, states were relatively weak in fiscal terms, and the wealthy were rarely called upon to shoulder the burdens of governance, let alone of redistribution. In 1900, the average top marginal tax rate in advanced economies was often below 10%, a reflection of the light touch of liberal economic orthodoxy. The elite freedoms of this age were inseparable from the early wave of globalization. Capital moved freely, empires secured open markets, and states competed to offer favorable terms to capital holders. It was a world in which political agency was subordinated to economic law, and the very idea of disciplining capital was cast as heretical. It was precisely the collapse of this early global order during World War I and II that reversed these trends. As international capital flows contracted and borders hardened, alongside much tougher restrictions on immigration flows, nation-states reclaimed authority over their economies. The necessities of war, conscription, production planning, rationing, and financing military expenditure compelled even liberal democracies to introduce steep taxes on the rich, price controls, and financial repression. Reassertion of the political, from liberalism to crisis statism. This historical contrast demonstrates the falsity of the liberal idea that peace and globalization naturally generate fairness or political strength. Rather, it was the breakdown of liberal peace and market cosmopolitanism, the very conditions elites celebrated, that made space for a more egalitarian order. Where the pre-war era allowed elites to transcend national borders, war brought them crashing back to earth, notwithstanding how certain financial interests, industries may have benefited. Thus, the notion that liberal capitalism, left to its own devices, will evolve toward equity or collective resilience is belied by history. In the face of crisis, the potential of external threats to radically put in question the status quo thus means both positing the wager of difficult decisions while at the same time presenting the opportunity for a radical questioning of power. Here, instead of recoding and thus domesticating such crises, re-internalizing them as part of shadowy elite plans in order to diffuse them of their potential in advance. It is necessary to see through the cynicism of the libertarian core of what underlies much of conspiracism when it speaks in the name of we. For far from it being a concern about our freedoms, restrictions, it is much more about using such rhetoric as a shield to forestall the implementation of policies which would affect the real elite, not a Hollywood caricature of Bond villains who would float above in a state of virtual untouchability. None of this is to suggest that catastrophe or war is necessary or desirable to precipitate meaningful political transformation. Rather, the lesson is diagnostic. Crises in the past revealed what it takes to force elite concessions and to make the economic subject to the political. However true it may be that crises create opportunity for the wealthy, the idea that lockdowns in themselves, whether tied to pandemics or the climate, would serve abstract elite purposes need only be considered in light of the presuppositions underpinning the ascendancy of global elites in terms of free movement of labor, goods, cheap energy, and so on. The paradox is that, by assuming such elite omnipotence, it is merely to reassert the idea that everything is under control, with the effect of further disempowering and depoliticizing so far as the very powerlessness that people feel is then fed back and reinforced by a simulation of politics which is meant to do the opposite. More than this, the scapegoating of caricatural elites, intent on doing harm for no apparent reason beyond evil for its own sake, merely serves like a red rag to a bull in deflecting from what underpins contemporary elite power as a whole, under the conditions of neoliberalism, particularly when it comes to deregulation underlying the very power of said elites, otherwise intent on apparently subverting the fluid nature of globalization. Conspiracism and the anti-fascist left. An interesting flip side of these arguments can be seen in an anti-fascist left discourse embodied by figures like Naomi Klein, whose works elaborating her concept of shock doctrine have had a major influence on the more neoliberal critical faction of the left. The shock doctrine, in a nutshell, is described as follows. As I delved deeper, I realized that this strategy had been a silent partner to the imposition of neoliberalism for more than 40 years. That shock tactics follow a clear pattern. Wait for a crisis, or even, in some instances as in Chile or Russia, help foment one. Declare a moment of what is sometimes called extraordinary politics, suspend some or all democratic norms, and then ram the corporate wish list through as quickly as possible. Apropos the Iraq War, and following the same kind of state of exception logic as Giorgio Agamben, a leftist who himself became, unsurprisingly, radically skeptical of COVID measures. It was also the clear mechanism of using crisis to ram through policies that would never have been feasible in normal times. When it comes to the Koch brothers, they are attracted to moments of cataclysm because non-apocalyptic reality is actually inhospitable to their anti-democratic ambitions. While Trump is said to relish in creating an atmosphere of terror and destabilization, in the standard leftist takes of Klein, talking up crises a la fascism means an excuse for bringing the feds into cities like Chicago, coupled with the pledge to block Muslims from entering the U.S., all following the same Republican neoliberal agenda encapsulated in the racism of abandoning black communities during Hurricane Katrina. What you can thus infer from all this is the same kind of paranoid and free-floating rationalizations as in conspiracy theories on the populist right. Despite libertarian billionaires like the Koch brothers refusing to back Trump during the 2016 Republican primaries, not to mention their role in hijacking and essentially subverting Trump's first term, you are to infer an invisible pipeline leading from neoliberalism to something just short of fascism, if not fascism full stop. Falling back on the classic leftist mantra that fascism is the last recourse for capitalism in crisis, while neoliberals, authoritarians, libertarian billionaires, warmongers, and America firsters are blithely thrown together in the same boat. Conclusion: the ambiguity of crisis and the political. As with the conspiracist side of the populist right, the basic presupposition is that crises can never be a problem for elites, but always something to be profited from. Likewise, the way the suspicion of fascism functions essentially entails that anything the government does is left open to the claim that it is merely an excuse for elites to grab further power. The role of soft power is thus always overshadowed by the brutal logic of disaster capitalism, disaster profiteering, such that a good versus evil framing merely perpetuates a depoliticized conception of power, whereby the easy glossing over of the ambiguities of the political only serves to undermine in advance the actual contestation of power, rendering its exercise, particularly that of the state, suspect in itself. For Klein, it is also a convenient way to link and thus disarm genuine populist discontent against neoliberalism with neoliberalism itself, such that any authentic contestation of the latter which doesn't abide by a narrow leftist framework can be immediately reframed as an expression of capitalism in crisis. If moments of shock in the past century in particular presented opportunities to contest power, then there is necessarily a conservative dimension to the political, apropos the demand for sacrifice in the wager of such contestation, against the false moral purity at the heart of both conspiracism and leftist anti-fascism, whether left liberal, Kleinian, or hard left, which only serves to flatten the tragic dimension of the political and thereby undermine both the promise and risk of contesting power, where assuming the sovereign responsibility for its exercise easily plays into the claim of engaging in the same so-called crisis politics as the other side.